Okay, so what I'd like to do with this, with my presentation is that it serve as an introduction for Rachel and Kat. We'll be talking about some of the management and planning approaches to urban forestry. But what I'd like to do is to take a perspective of science and how science and research using this ecosystem, and I call it a social-ecosystem approach, can help us better manage and plan our urban forests, okay? And to do this, I'd like to use two case studies from when I was at Florida. These studies were applied. They were meant to provide information to managers and planners, such as yourself. They were transdisciplinary in the sense that it wasn't just researchers and managers working together, but we also included the citizens, residents, different stakeholder groups. And although these were very specific research projects, some of the findings really helped us understand some of the other issues and some of the considerations that managers, planners, and even researchers have to take when we define very specific goals and objectives. And that when we understand these systems, it leads us to understand different results, different feedbacks, different conflicts, and become aware of different realities that were overlooked by being so specific. Okay, so again, to emphasize the importance of this socio-ecosystem approach, and to remind everybody of the importance of science, and that's particularly important in these times when it's being questioned so much. So to do this, I'll use two case studies from South Florida, and again, then Rachel and Kat will talk about some experiences from here in Los Angeles. So these two case studies have several things in common. We talk about tree species selection and restoration. They have to do with environmental policies, specifically establishing tree cover goals, tree canopy goals, and using urban forests to mitigate carbon dioxide. Okay? But they also talk about values, that is the importance the different segments of the community, of society, place on this resource and on these systems. And we'll also talk a little bit about the perspective of these different stakeholder groups, okay? And we'll also talk about scales, not just across space, but also across time. And we'll give you some specific examples of that. And as Kat will mention later on, another one that's missing from the list here is context, being aware of the biophysical and the socio-political realities of where we're working, okay? So these two case studies were from Miami-Dade County and Fort Lauderdale. The Miami-Dade County study was to understand ecosystem services from Miami-Dade's urban forest. And we did this project with the University of Florida, the Department of Environmental Resource Management, and the Florida Forest Service. The Fort Lauderdale project was part of a master's thesis involving the tree giveaway program for the city of Fort Lauderdale. And we did that with the University of Florida, the then Municipal Urban Forester for Fort Lauderdale, and the Sustainability Division. So let me get into a little bit of detail on these two case studies. So the first case study was in Miami-Dade, a very specific research project where we wanted to understand what the ecosystem services were across Miami-Dade's urban forest, okay? We focused on structure and the benefits, the ecosystem services. So we used the typical approach, right? The plots, the eco plots, back then they were called the U4 plots, sometimes often referred to or using the urban FIA approach. But with this site-specific data, we were able to model and estimate different ecosystem services, among them carbon dioxide, okay, offsets, sequestration, the amount of carbon that's sequestered by the urban forest in Miami for that specific year we analyzed. Okay. And to the right, you see a map. And that map is basically a heat map using geostatistics. And the darker the areas on the map, the more carbon dioxide sequestration is going on. So what's interesting here is that we see some specific areas that are dark, where there's a lot of carbon sequestration going on. Okay, so what's going on in those areas? Let's take a look. So one of our findings was that 34% of all the carbon dioxide sequestration going on during that time period was by one tree species, Melaleuca area, right? And it sequestered 34% of all the carbon dioxide for that year. But as it turns out, that tree is highly invasive. And it was introduced in the early 1900s for erosion control and up to a certain point to drain the wetlands. In fact, it was introduced by the Army Corps of Engineers. So we're getting into some interesting dynamics here when we go across time, in that a tree species that was selected in the early 1900s to do a job, and it did it fairly well, of controlling erosion and draining what was then swamps, is now considered an invasive tree. And as part of several policies, among them the Everglades Restoration Plan, and the need to control invasive species, millions of dollars are being spent to eradicate this tree. So let's think about that a little bit, right? You have one tree species that's sequestering 34% of all the carbon dioxide. That tree is highly invasive. Millions of dollars are being spent to eradicate it. But at the same time, other municipalities, other local governments are planting trees in large part to do what? To sequester carbon dioxide. So it's interesting when we take this long-term picture approach, we see that yes, carbon dioxide, that trees are sequestering carbon dioxide, but some of those trees are highly invasive. But what's interesting is that they were introduced over 100 years ago to do a very specific job, and they did. So these priorities, these policies change over time, and we need to be aware of that. And I think Kat's going to give us some examples, and Rachel's also going to talk a little bit about this, right, about these policies that we define. Sometimes they're very specific, but they can have sometimes unintended effects. So case study number 2. And here we switch from a more biophysical approach to a more socio-ecological approach. And in this study, also in South Florida, we were looking at the City of Fort Lauderdale's tree giveaway program, okay? And part of what this program is meant to do is increase tree canopy in the City of Fort Lauderdale, right? So that's another important policy going on in several cities, is increasing our urban tree canopy cover by establishing these goals, right, for a fixed amount of tree cover. So to assess this tree giveaway program, we used a survey of 500 respondents, 500 people in Broward County. And we used a choice experiment approach. So these choice experiments are highly structured surveys where we present respondents with different alternatives, and the respondents choose these different alternatives, and they choose the different characteristics of those alternatives. So that way we can focus in on specific characteristics of these alternatives, right, and weigh them, see which ones are more or less important. And what we're trying to get at was whether people identified barriers or opportunities to participate in these tree giveaway programs. And just as importantly, we were interested in finding what kind of tree types, functional traits, these folks are interested in or not. And this was part, again, of a master's thesis from Leah Dawes that she did during her internship there at the City of Fort Lauderdale. So what are some of the findings? So we found that fruit-bearing and native trees were more preferred than flowering or shade trees. And again, you have to stop and think there about the importance of shade trees in obtaining these tree canopy goals. Okay. Another finding, Latinos, African American respondents preferred fruit trees. White, high-income respondents preferred native trees, and generally low-income respondents were the ones that identified the greatest barriers to participating in these programs because of lack of awareness, lack of transportation, and other factors. Okay, so let's think about the ecosystem implications of it. So we established these tree canopy goals, and we, meaning technical specialists, a lot of people listening in on this webinar, and we often focus on shade trees, right, because of their benefits, shading benefits. But what we found through the study was that different groups don't prioritize these shade trees and aren't often aware of these tree canopy goals. They prefer other values. They prefer other tree functional types, right? And this brings into our factoring in for these different values that a lot of these groups that prefer native trees are often wealthier and have more influence, And Rachel will have some examples of that from here in Los Angeles. So again, we have these conflicting values that we can identify when we take this ecosystem approach, in that these tree canopy goals we set and these tree species we prefer often aren't the ones that citizens and that society prefers. So this is where engagement and other approaches of including people and this social-ecological approach, right? Understanding the people and the systems and the big picture is important to better obtain these goals. And I'll close with this approach that ecologists often use, that even though it's important to understand ecology, the ecology of specific species, characteristics, processes in cities, it's equally important to look at the ecology of cities. However, as we've seen, depending on the problem, we often need to go beyond ecology and include other disciplines, right? And that's the best way to approach these problems, because they're complex. And as we see what we define as goals and policies in the near term in our budget cycle, when we look at the long term and look at values, it's complicated, because often other people are overlooked. People with more power, influence, have more say over some of these topics. And so with that, I'll close. And Rachel will talk a little bit more about engagement, and Kat will talk about more of these considerations that one needs to take about when we look at these urban ecosystems. And so thank you. And with that, I'll pass it on to Rachel and Kat.